Welcome to the Divorce Podcast, where we explore all aspects of ending relationships, separation, and parenting apart. If your marriage or partnership has ended, or you have friends and family who are separating, this podcast is for you. I'm Kate Daly, a relationship counsellor, divorce specialist, and co-founder of Amicable, the online legal service for separating couples. In each episode, we look at relationships and separation from different angles, including the emotional, legal, and social. I'm joined by experts and special guests who share their own unique stories, experience, and tips with the goal of helping people end relationships in a kinder and better way. In this episode, I'm joined by therapist and author Joanna Harrison to discuss arguments in relationships, parenting, and separation. We begin by discussing Joanna's book, 5 Arguments All Couples Need to Have and Why the Washing Up Matters. Joanna explains how arguments around communication, backgrounds, daily chores, personal space, and sex can impact relationships. We also explore how these conflicts can manifest between ex-partners and co-parents. Throughout our conversation, we explore common scenarios involving these arguments and ways to approach them more constructively. We end with Joanna's communication tips for co-parents, including creating space and time for important decisions and finding curiosity about your ex-partner. If you loved this episode, then please subscribe and rate us on your preferred listening platform. Welcome, Joanna.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's lovely to see you. I'm very excited to talk about the book. It's been trailed all over my social media, so hopefully it will be familiar to some of our listeners as well. Let's start, if we can, by just giving me a little bit of background. How did you come up with the idea for the book?
So it was there for a while. I think what happened I made the switch from being a lawyer to being a therapist, and then have been working as a couple therapist for quite a long time, and kept seeing these sort of same issues come up for couples, which is what I call my 5 arguments. And whilst, of course, every couple who's together or separating is unique in their way, there were these themes that I wanted to kind of remind couples that other people are struggling with. I think that's, part of your ethos as well, isn't it? It's sort of divorce. You don't want to feel you're the first person in the world to be struggling with something. And because we're so private about our personal relationships, I felt it would be helpful to bring these themes into the light to help people see and to kind of spread the word, I suppose, about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you see the same themes in your lawyering work as you did in your therapeutic work then? Because that's quite a big jump, isn't it, to go from, we will call it the dark side to the light side, but I might be offending you there, so you don't have to agree with me.
No, I mean, I definitely, working as a lawyer, I was drawn to work with relationships, and I was so interested in the reasons that relationships broke down, and actually the legal forum is kind of appropriately not so interested in those aspects, can't kind of get into all of that. And that was when I knew that I needed to maybe work in the same field, but a different angle. But I think now looking back, and I do think that these core arguments that I've written about often were connected to the reasons that couples end their relationships. And I see that now when I'm working with people, like one of my arguments is about how do people share up the roles, all the responsibilities. I see when that one isn't sort of resolved successfully between a couple, and I'm sure you've seen this, that really builds up resentment that can kind of corrode over time, I suppose, and get in the way of things going well in a couple.
I think you made a really important point there as well, which is that the legal system, rightly, as you say, isn't interested in the emotional argument of why a relationship's broken down. And I think people are often quite surprised that they have to go through a process that doesn't care about how you got there. And it's quite hard sometimes, isn't it? So I think it's really important to try and have another forum, like the way that we work or like the way that you work, where you can explore what brought you to this point and where you need to go from here.
Exactly. That supports mourning. And as we know, trying to do that emotional work through a set of legal arguments is a kind of round peg in a square hole. It's a very expensive way of not doing it very well. The legal stuff is required. You need to resolve our marriages ending practically, but to be able to feel all the nuance, all the different things that built up to a marriage ending, all the different responses to it, requires, a different kind of forum. And people don't expect that.
So, yeah, no, I agree. They don't expect that. I think that's what's so surprising and sometimes so difficult for people to navigate, isn't it? We're going to go through the arguments in the book, but just before we do that, then let's just get our terminology straight then.
Okay.
Define what you mean by an argument then. So are these arguments that people have, or is it just a way of grouping the ideas? You tell us what you mean.
I think it's two different aspects. So yes, I mean, arguments, I guess as a couple therapist, people come in and out of my consulting room and bring the things that they're struggling with, the issues that, maybe they've had an argument about, an actual argument where, they're disagreeing, there's conflict, the kind of standard definition of an argument, I suppose. But I suppose for the book, I also kind of mean these core issues that couples have to navigate that might be knotty, or like my first one is communication. How we communicate with each other. We're going to have our different ideas. We're going to have different experiences in family that have taught us how to communicate in a different way. It kind of is an issue. It's going to be, we're not going to find that we're the same. Unless it's a miracle kind of thing. We're just different. So I suppose it's also to convey difference that we have to find a way of living with if we're in a relationship.
And communication is one that comes up time and time again, isn't it? So I know even when you're at the end of a relationship and the relationship is changing, particularly if you have children, there's still a need to be able to communicate, isn't there? So it feels like it's the lifeblood of all of our kind of relationships, communication.
It's the thing that people most often come in for help with. And I think on divorce, I often say to people, or think with people, they sometimes think that on divorce that their partner is going to be different, or that they're going to find things have improved, but actually you still might be stuck in the same dynamics. And that's a hard thing to face, as you say, when there's children and there is more to communicate about when you're living separately, all the day-to-day stuff, all the planning, all the what's in the school bag, you need to do this when you've got the children next week. Suddenly it can be a bit of a surprise to couples that they're having to communicate more with their partner than they kind of ever thought they were going to. And so it is important, I wrote about the arguments as well for how do these apply to separated parents? Like, it's important to look at that, I guess.
And so what do you think people at the point of separation need to say to each other about communication?
Well, it also flows, I guess, from how they're feeling about each other, which goes to what we were talking about before. If there's resentments, kind of hostilities at the end, how they seek to end the marriage, the climate of that will inevitably improve their communication. But it's also thinking about how to optimize is a bit of a clinical word, but I often think with separating couples, when are they going to communicate and how, like physically, is important. Like, are you going to send each other long emails and sort of at times that are intrusive, or can you work towards a situation where you agree how you're going to communicate about things, how you're going to have the necessary conversations that you need to do, how are you going to kind of create boundaries around that now that you're moving into a more separate way. And I'm not saying this happens overnight, but it needs some thinking, because it needs a bit. I think when it works well, it's when both have given a bit of thought to it. It's also about how you listen to each other, and listening is a really important aspect of communication, as we know. Can you bear to acknowledge that your partner feels something, your ex-partner feels something that you don't? Are you locked in a battle for who's right? Those things also affect, the way in which you're going to be communicating with each other.
And I suppose it's understanding listening as opposed to waiting to speak, because there's obviously a big difference, isn't there?
Yes.
And I think as well, people, you're right, what you said before was absolutely spot on. It's a process that you have to transition through because it doesn't happen overnight. It's not something that suddenly you wake up, you've decided to be separated, and therefore all the rules change on the next day, on the hour, and you start behaving in a different way. It's a slow process of realization, isn't it, of what needs to change and how the relationship perhaps needs to become maybe sometimes a little bit more formal. And as you said, more boundaried, certainly.
Yeah. But and again, I suppose when you asked at the beginning, why did I write the book? I want separating couples to have confidence that we don't get all these things right with each other overnight, like in this situation. Often when we learn best how to communicate with each other or how to grapple with something difficult, it's because we've sort of got it wrong. We're always helping children understand that we learn, the idea of learning from mistakes. And it's the same in relationships. I think in separating couples, it doesn't feel a particularly safe place often to make mistakes. And I'm not talking about serious mistakes that affect safety, but, actually, if you can allow each other to kind of get it wrong or kind of do something in a way you didn't expect or misattune to each other, that's okay. That's going to be part of the landscape of this new world that you're both in. And if you can come back together and communicate about what went wrong, help each other understand how you felt about it, make time to sort of repair things when they went wrong, that will help you on the journey, really. And it's not, you can't, I know people are anxious and they want these things sorted out from the beginning because that gives certainty and comfort. But actually it is, I think we know in practice, it's a bit messier than that.
A lot messier, isn't it? And you're right. You can understand totally why people want things absolutely sorted out and written down.
Of
But
course.
it's the relationship rather than the piece of paper and the rules on the piece of paper that actually is what's going to carry this through, isn't it? And to create a safe space for your kids to be parented and so on and so forth. List out the arguments then. So you say there's 5. How did you frame the argument around communication? And then let's hear the others.
Well, it was kind of different ways, like, you never listen to me or we can't argue kind of thing, different aspects of that. The second one was your family drives me crazy. And, that's something that we all have to kind of learn to cope with aspects of our own families, each other's families. And, I think always culturally, one family is completely different from another family, the way that they do things, the ideas that they have. So that's at one level. And then at a sort of deeper level, there's the family inside us, our kind of more deeper hopes, our deeper fears or worries about things. If you were looking at that in a divorce context, I think sometimes families of origin can kind of, there's a bit, people kind of retreat a bit, their family of origin helps them, supports. And suddenly these things feel a bit stronger or more intense. Yeah, that different ideas from the different families can create tension, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's natural to retreat back into your camp, isn't it, when a divorce or a separation happens? And then that can then start to feel very tribal, can't it? And the tribe puts their arms around one person within the camp, and then the other tribe puts their arms around the other person. And all of a sudden, even when you've tried to keep things amicable or the lines of communication open, it can feel like you're swimming against the tide of your family who are trying to protect you, and they're doing it because they love you. But we often say in the work that we do that sometimes friends and family can be quite unhelpful without meaning to be. They can be in your ear saying things that aren't necessarily going to help you move this relationship on into a different space. And so sometimes, with the best will in the world, you have to take their advice, however well-meaning, with a bit of a pinch of salt, don't you? I guess you must find similar.
And I think that, looking at the sort of deeper levels in families, separation and divorce will have, again, a different meaning for every family. There'll be a different kind of family attitude to separation, different experiences of divorce and separation, different messages about it, different cultural kind of ideas about it. And that is all in the pot as well. So I think we have to be live to the kind of tensions around that that could clash as a couple separate, because there might be a lot of different messages in that. Different values, that could be expressed in the finances, different values around what the money means or that sort of thing.
So go on, carry on with the list.
Okay, third one I flagged earlier. So that's roles. In the book, it's like, you never take the bin out. Who does what is a big point of contention, I guess. And something that I think every couple, if they have children as well, when the workload gets bigger, they have to kind of work out who is doing what. And there might be quite a lot of negotiation around that. And I also talk about all the unseen work that goes on in relationships. And if you were talking about that in a divorce context, there's still all the work of being in a family and your job, all the work that is kind of involved. And that again might need a renegotiation, and it's not just about children. I saw Rosie Green's post the other day about how when she got divorced, she felt so embarrassed that she didn't know how to pump up her tires because it had always been her husband's job. But, we have to kind of take on new jobs that maybe are unfamiliar. Every single couple will have their own version of that. And again, the other one I see is like the invisible stuff that gets done in families. Who's doing that? How does that get done?
We often refer to that as the mental load piece. And that's sometimes the last and hardest thing to transfer because it's hard to let go of on one hand. And if you've never been doing it, if you're the parent that's never been taking that mental load, there's no expectation from your side that you're not doing something because you've never done it. It's not a missing piece. It's easy to see that you're not taking the children to school or you're not packing the bags or whatever, but just keeping the mental load stuff going, like remembering that, there's a party you've got to buy a present for and all of that kind of stuff, or whatever it is, the mental load element of it. It's huge. And I think if you haven't been the parent who's had a lot to do in the home space and you are taking that role moving forward as part of a divorce, I think that's a big, hard piece to ask. It takes a bit of time to get used to that and carrying that as well. And sometimes our institutions don't help. Like how many primary schools still will always phone the mum first. And, it doesn't matter how many times you say on a Wednesday and Thursday, it's always my ex-husband and you need to be phoning him. They just don't seem to be able to get it. So it's sort of made harder sometimes by the people around us as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think, because the person who feels they carry more of it, which is often the woman, that can build up frustration. But as I think you're also flagging that someone might need a bit of help to kind of take on, there's a dynamic shift. Something might have to be let go. Someone might have to take it on. It might take a bit of time. There might have to be mourning about the fact that one person just doesn't seem wanting to take it on, and to kind of stop the argument about it and become, there's very many different aspects to it, but it's really important and disproportionately isn't seen.
Yeah, exactly. I think the whole roles thing, because sometimes people get very territorial when they're going through the separation, don't they? It's always been like this. I've always done this, or I've always done that. And therefore that's what needs to continue. Whereas another way of looking at it is, well, this is an opportunity to challenge the way it's been done and think about whether there could be new creative ways of doing it in the future. And that's all very well for me to sit here and say that. But if you're the person who's been asked to let go of something that you enjoy doing in order to accommodate the other person, that's pretty tough. That can feel like a real loss to people, and a loss where you're giving up something to somebody who at the beginning of this isn't able to do it, never shown any interest before, and all of a sudden wants to do it at a time when you just want to hunker down and do what you've always done. So it can be fraught with tension.
Really painful, real losses about the shift to the parenting relationship, I suppose. And I do think it's really helpful in all couples to kind of at least start to have a conversation about what those unseen things are, just to bring them out into the light, not, in a way that supports it, not to kind of be blaming you don't see it, but to literally just give them a moment. And then I suppose in the most positive situation, you'd want to be able to discuss how those things are going to be taken forward. But I agree, for some, it feels a really painful transition.
Yeah. And I think sometimes, we fall into bad habits. I've had many a time where, and it is often a dad who is meant to have the children on his days and something happens at work. And it's like, well, I can't have them anymore because I've got a work commitment. Well, it's the relearning that doesn't mean you default back to your ex-wife, but that you have to make the arrangements that enables you to do your work commitment and make sure your kids get picked up from school or whatever, not just default to the other person. because they need to have their life and they need to know when their time is their time. So it's a learning thing, isn't it? It might be that you've always had the arrangement where one of you picks up the slack, but moving forward, those things need discussing. And if you want to carry that on, great. But if you don't, because you're sharing the care in a different way and trying to share that mental load, then it's about learning new skills and learning new habits, isn't it?
Yeah, which can be
moving things on.
incredibly sort of developmental. You know, people are able to kind of get in touch with the things that they couldn't do, and to kind of gain pleasure out of doing it. And you know, I think with that example, again, like family life isn't neat and tidy at the best of times when a couple are kind of getting on, and it speaks to the importance of having an amicable outcome where you have goodwill in the relationship, so that if actually you are caught short or it's really difficult, that there's a mutual interest in helping each other out, and it doesn't feel like but you know, you're able to be grateful to each other and kind of be mutually, you know, help the other person. And it takes a village, it takes the two parents and as many people around as possible. But it's that quality that you're so passionate about, the good feeling that makes those moments kind of bearable, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I always think that it's goodwill and patience that replaces sex as the oil for the relationship, isn't it, when you separate?
Oh, that I really like that.
That's how I always think about it. Something's got to replace it, hasn't it? So it's goodwill and patience, but it's got to be, I think you use the word mutual. That's, I think, sometimes where it becomes difficult for people, when it feels for one of you that it's just one way.
I think that's really good. The oil it is about that. It is about, what keeps it sort of going smoothly, actually, even though it's crazy and one of the children is ill and you're stuck in a meeting and
always,
whatever.
Yeah. So I can't remember what number we got to,
number
but
4.
I don't think we've done.
Okay, so in the book, it's comings and goings, which is, you know, I think in relationships, we're always trying to sort of navigate space and distance with each other. What does it feel like when we're apart from each other? Or sometimes when we're together, do we need a bit more space? You know, all of these things. And there's a lot of comings and goings when we separate, particularly if we have children, that can stir up lots of different feelings. It's often in those transitions that the kind of big emotions come out, I suppose, just as it can be in a couple that are together. But, you know, we know that handovers can be emotionally charged. Meeting up with a co-parent might not be easy. These sort of ebbs and flows of family lives, and we've all got our own specific sensitivities. And I think, you know, it's about trying to be aware of each other, and still, when you're separated, of what makes one person feel anxious won't necessarily be what makes the other person anxious. You could think, I have an example in the book, I think, where one couple, that one of them's going out and she's not keeping in touch with her partner, I think something like that. But, you know, we might think about that in terms of how do we cope when our children are away? How do we communicate with each other? It's all back to communication again, really. Do we keep in touch, or do we sort of, you know, do we send some photos? That to one person, that might be really important. The other person might not care so much, but we'll all have our bespoke idea of how we want to tolerate distance.
Yeah. And I think sometimes what's lost in all of that is we think we have to do the same both ways. And you're right, it depends on the sensitivity, and it doesn't have to be just because I might want the pictures. If you don't want the pictures, that's fine. It doesn't always have to go both ways. I think we sometimes miss a trick about being creative and being able to say what we actually need and want, versus just having something that looks very equal and fair. And I think we conflate equal and fair as words and concepts all of the time in divorce. And it's just like, it's one of my biggest bugbears. Equal and fair are two completely different constructs, and they don't mean the same thing. They are not sometimes interchangeable, and therefore we miss a trick on being creative, I think, sometimes. And that just,
I like that. It's a bit like sort of, you know, what's your love language? That we all like different things being expressed in a different way. And I think we can still bring that on separation. What's important to you? And also, if, you know, why was that so important to you? That's where an argument could help. Like, what is it that upsets you so much about me being 10 minutes late, kind of thing? I need to understand that, because then I can attune myself better to you. And maybe someone is really relaxed about timing, but someone else, it makes them, you know, feel really anxious. Who knows? but we can still be curious when we're separated, I think.
Well, that's the thing. It's treating some of this difference with a curious mindset rather than an accusatory mindset, isn't it? Because when we're separating, it tends to be like you're doing this on purpose. And sometimes I often say to people, one of the sort of biggest mistakes you can make is to over attribute intent, when sometimes things just happen because somebody's a bit lazy or forgetful or whatever, not because they were genuinely trying to hurt you or deliberately trying to stir things up. And I think that over attribution sometimes is a real nightmare when you're trying to help people. And sometimes it's just like stuff just happens. Sometimes it goes wrong. People are sometimes a bit crappy. Just try not to feel that every act is deliberate and personal, because a lot of the time it just isn't. And a lot of the time it's not even about you. It's about them and their crappy day and stuff that's going on for them.
I know. I mean, I talk about that a lot. I think I completely agree. And I guess the more heightened the sort of level of proceedings, or the way in which you're divorced, the more heightened the situation between you. If you've full-blown litigation, everything is sort of seen through the worst kind of possible lens, and everything is assumed to be strategic, even if it's not. This might be hopeless. As you say, we can imagine all sorts of things about why something has happened, and often see it in the worst light because that goodwill and patience has gone. And really, as you say, it might just be life.
Yeah. Or I might just be like that. One of you is inevitably more time pressured and precious than the other. It's very rare you get two very time critical people in the same relationship, isn't it? Because it sort of drives you nuts. So there's always one person who is always 10 minutes late, and it's not about you, it's about them. and yeah, sure, they might need to do some work on it to improve themselves. But also, the only thing you can often change is your reaction to something, not somebody else's behavior. And I think if you can learn that mantra and keep that in mind when you're trying to co-parent, that we can only take responsibility for our own actions and not get drawn into a tit for tat, petty spiraling situation, but just be the best parent and the best person you can be, and focus on that. And then focus on learning how to calm yourself so you can deal with their behavior rather than try and change it. I think they're the skills you need. I wish somebody had told me this at the beginning.
And all these ways of kind of supporting a forum between you that isn't about changing, that might be about explaining your own boundaries and about trying to think with each other. And I'm talking about parents here because there's less reason, I suppose, for people to come together and think together. They don't have children, but to be able to chew over, is it helpful, the amount of screen time that they're having at the moment, kind of what that's about. Not like, oh, you're just so rubbish, like, why is, but actually, trying to sort of look at it from above with a bit of a bird's eye view.
I think this one you've touched on, this fourth one, is the most important, because the biggest, hardest thing to accept when you go through a separation is the concept of not seeing your kids every day. That's when they're little in particular. I think this is one of the hardest things for people to grapple with, to get hold of, and to find some peace and acceptance with, because it's tough. And it's not what you signed up for. Man, it's not what your kids signed up for either. So it does take a lot of, I'm so admiring of people who've been able to navigate this well and come out the other side and can accept that, you both need time and with your children, and you make it work. Go on then, on to the fifth one.
Okay, I was just going to say it's also about building up trust in that, isn't it? The fifth one is kind of sex and bodies. And I guess when you're not with someone, does that become irrelevant? I suppose someone might be having sex somewhere else, and that can be quite that needs really careful kind of introduction, new partners. It is I do sort of see, is this transition. It's because, like with parents, we keep coming back to talking about it because the relationship is ongoing. You even have to find a different way of being bodily, don't you? You're still going hopefully to parents meeting together. But there's this shift in, what's that going to look like? It's going to be new. It's going to be unfamiliar. How are we going to greet each other?
Yes. Are we allowed to touch each other anymore, even if it's just a pat on the arm or whatever it is? Is that suddenly a big deal? And we talk to people where perhaps they've separated, but they're still living in the same house. Very few people have got a spare bedroom these days. And therefore, even having to share the same bed, and all of a sudden the bed and the physicality and watching people undress or undressing in the same room, all of those things are really difficult, and they all need naming, speaking about, and renegotiating. And you often get one person who just thinks, well, until we're physically, out of the house together, we might as well just carry on as normal. It's no big deal. And then for other people, it can be a real sense of intrusion and a real violation of privacy all of a sudden, to have somebody who they're no longer seeing as their life partner in the room while they're undressing. Or it's a complete, I think it's something that's very seldom spoken about, but I think it has quite a deep impact on people.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. I mean, I say in the book, how hard it is to put the physical side of things into words. I think we, it's number 5 because it's the hardest one to talk about bodies and to put those things into words. They're very sort of primitive, and it's weird for people who've been together for a long time to then kind of change those things. That situation, as I know, people finding themselves in increasingly, that is a classic one of where the physical represents is sort of something that's so familiar that has to be completely reworked. Like, couples so often bring about like the milk. They're living in the same house, but they're not filling up the milk. Everyone's getting their own milk, kind of thing. Or people get that wrong. It's sort of, how are we going to do this? What are the basics here of everyday life that we thought we knew so well?
Yeah, because I think people are understandably worried about giving mixed messages as well, aren't they? And, is it okay if do I have to sleep on the sofa because that's going to give me a bad back? Is it not okay if we share the bed and just for now kind of thing? But what does that then communicate? If you're just doing it without talking about it, then you are leaving yourself open, aren't you, to all kinds of unspoken mixed messages, open for interpretation. And then you've got the other layer of what happens if you've told your kids already that you're separated, but you're still sharing a bedroom, and what happens if you haven't told your kids, but you're not sharing a bedroom, and that kind of stuff, and how you navigate that stuff is pretty important.
Yeah, I suppose it starts with sort of trying to be respectful, trying to recognize each other as different, having an open mind to things being, and again, it comes back to being able to communicate about it, doesn't it? I mean, like with nesting couples, that needs a lot of communicating to be able to be possible for that to work. But it's the same sort of thing. It's like recognizing that boundaries that have been so familiar that they don't really exist, that they're new. Like, everything is different and new, and you're going to get it wrong again, and learn probably from where it goes wrong as much as from the preemptive conversations.
Well, it sounds like this book is an important read, whether you're separating or whether you're at the beginning of the journey. It feels like it's one of those things, as you say, all couples, whatever your status, you need to have a read of this book and have some of these conversations.
Well, I hope so. I think it's helpful if both read it rather than just one.
Well, yes, of course. Yeah. Well, there you go. Maybe that's one of the positive things you can do if you're co-parenting, is buy each other the book and be seen reading it together. But I guess ultimately what we're saying is, whatever stage of relationship you're in, it is important to have these conversations. And I guess arguing is healthy, because I think there's always a danger, and I'm always super conscious of this when we're doing the podcast, and I don't ever want to come across like we're preaching at people about you have to do things a certain way. But there's always that worry, isn't there, that we're somehow criticizing, and you could be listening to this in the middle of it thinking, I haven't done any of this, I haven't done that, I haven't done this. But it's not about that. I mean, we're not trying to set people up to be paragons of virtue. Arguing, rowing, whatever you want to call it, is a natural part of being in a close relationship. If you row in front of your kids, it's not the end of the world. They're not going to be suddenly damaged. What kids need to see is you resolving those arguments rather than not having them at all. So I guess that's a bit of the premise of the book, isn't it? That you need to have these arguments. We're not saying you should shy away from them. You've got to have them, but you've got to find a path through them to resolution.
Yeah, exactly. All of that. I think that, if we're in a relationship with someone, there's likely to be differences and tensions And unless we're angels, that's going to kind of leak out at some point, and how we handle that is important. You and I know that if a couple are in, frequent hostile conflict that never gets resolved, that is really bad for kids. But as you say, like, modeling how to resolve conflict is super helpful. And from all the adult couples that I work with, when I ask them about their families, as I do, sometimes they'll say, well, we just didn't have an example of how to resolve conflict. And now we are in conflict and we don't know we just don't have any blueprints for that. And we're going to find conflict in all aspects of our lives. So if our parents can show us how to sort it out. And again, that is not neat and tidy either, but an attempt. I heard an example the other day about, when parents sort of, that thing where you're like, right, you're off your screen and you can't have it now for like the next year. And then you think, oh no, I've got to keep to what I said. And the suggestion was that, that parents can still go back to the children and say, actually, I got that wrong. I said that in the heat of the moment, but I've actually thought, and that is really nice modelling to children that when we admit that we're wrong. And similarly with each other, and children seeing that we do that with each other is helpful.
Yeah, I think so. And also things like, I use the technique where sometimes, because my son was a nightmare with the whole screen time thing, still is. He's a bit bigger now, but
it's a nightmare for everyone.
It's just so exhausting. And I would go in exactly that. And we'd be arguing about screen time, and I'd land some huge long 2-week ban of this or that or whatever. And I realized that it just wasn't working because I couldn't remember what I'd said. And I'd started to keep this very long and complicated spreadsheet of when the ban started and stopped. And it just became a nightmare. So in the end, I got into the habit of just saying, I'm really angry. I am going to punish, but I'm going to think about what that punishment is going to be. And then I'd walk away because I'd have to give myself some brain cooling off time to think about how realistic the punishment was going to be, and not end up doing the 2 weeks, 1 month ban and then never sticking to it because he just got used to the idea that I'd say one thing and do something completely different. So yeah, I can sympathize.
That's an important point, isn't it, for couples who are separating, is it's okay to not, I think people can feel anxious, it's different, everything's strange, you feel under pressure. You can always say, can I just think about that? Can I just have a think and come back to you about that, and kind of, retreat to your space, get your head around it. Obviously, not to kind of use that to sort of disrupt something, but just, you don't always have to do everything in the heat of the moment. And quite often people in contact with their ex, can feel like, my mind just went blank.
Yeah, it's the difference between react and respond, isn't it? So don't react. And I always say to people, just because someone says something, one, you don't have to respond. You can just leave it hanging there. Sometimes that's the most powerful thing. Just say nothing and just say, okay, thank you. And then you're creating some time, and you're not getting into that back and forth as it slowly ratchets up till it gets to explosion point. But yeah, I often think that just because someone says it doesn't make it true, and you don't have to answer, you don't have to respond. You can choose not to. If that buys you some time to give a more considered response that will take the sting out of something, then that's a great skill to learn, isn't it? It's hard. All of this is hard. Just sort of from an ending point, any top tips for separating parents as they're navigating these kinds of new rules and new boundaries? What would you say to someone who's listening and is maybe in the thick of this and thinking, right, I need to think about how I'm going to navigate this next phase?
I think we've sort of touched on it, but I think it's, you will feel panicked, but you don't have to have, unless there's some sort of emergency safety situation, you don't have to have everything. Like, it's not going to be all sorted overnight, and creating a climate in which you have got time to really think about things is really helpful. So I know people get really worried about sorting things and wanting to pin things down in the kind of concrete, practical way. But, your work that kind of supports people to be able to take time. So that's one. I think trying to find curiosity. All of those things are helpful if you've got your own support. I mean, fundamentally, supporting yourself as an adult through the divorce, looking into getting professional holding, really, to hold you while you reconfigure your life is just such a good investment to be able to think about everything that needs to happen. I think often people think, well, I haven't got time for that.
Or money. I haven't got the time or the money to invest in that. You're right. I think that's a common argument.
Yeah.
And if you can create some space and time and a bit of money, even if you save up over a period of time and just a small amount away so you can access some support, or that you look for free resources or whatever, I think that's a huge, huge benefit to you. And like you say, it's an investment.
Yeah, it is. It's something to hold on to or help you see things. It'll kind of help unfog lenses, I think. And I think it's helpful for everyone in moments of change to be able to reflect somewhere. And it's great if your friends and family are really supportive, but it's different working with someone neutral.
And do you think you can use your book to actually decide whether or not there's legs left in a relationship? So if you think it's come to absolutely that crunch point, do you think the book is a helpful tool for helping people decide whether this is irreparable or not?
Yeah, there's a whole chapter about, how to think about ending a relationship. I think often that's such a difficult decision to take. And, the difficult thing about it is that one person's idea of when a relationship should end is different from another's within a relationship. But that also means people are left having to decide, there's no rules. And, unless I think when the relationship is unsafe for both or one person or for the children, that is a definite sign that this is not. But it's really for couples that I put in the chapter lots of different questions you can ask yourself to kind of help you reflect on that, because it isn't an easy decision. It will have different meanings. So, often couples will ask me, should we end it? How do I know? And it's not the same answer for it's different for everyone. But there are different aspects you can reflect on.
Thank you so much
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to chat.
No, it's been lovely talking to you and really interesting, deep diving into the book. Where can people find the book?
In all the usual places.
Fantastic. Bookshops, online. Do you have a website or anything that directs people to you if they want help from you specifically?
Yeah, joannaharrison.co.uk, and I'm on Instagram, Joanna Harrison Couple Therapy, and I'm always happy to help people, find therapists or...
Brilliant. Well, we'll put all of your contact details in the show notes as well. But thank you very much indeed for joining me today. If you want to find out more about Joanna, go to the show notes and visit her website. You can find out more about The Divorce Podcast at thedivorcepodcast.com or from your favourite listening platforms. There's lots of help and advice as well on the Amicable website. And we do have a blog called Is It Over? Should I Leave? So maybe you can compare themes between Joanna's book and our blog and see where you get to. But thank you, everybody, for listening.